An old man named Henri Vasseur lives alone in Paris. Meanwhile, a girl named Constance lives in a town a bit far from Paris. She is attempting her driving test for the 5th time, but is struggling to pass once again. Constance helps her father at his shop, but she longs to escape to Paris, away from the shop. Her father, however, is not happy with her desire to leave. While searching for a place to live in Paris, Constance comes across Henri, who behaves oddly due to his old age. Henri's son had decided to rent out a room in the house, but Henri was against having any tenants. During her visit, Constance notices a piano in the house that no one is allowed to play. She likes the house, but finds Henri rude and quickly realizes he doesn't want her as a tenant. He comes up with various excuses to say no to her. After leaving Henri's house, Constance resumes her search for a place to stay. Constance was having an affair with a married man named Arthur, and one day, while spending time with him, she learned that she had finally secured a room for rent in Henri's house. Her dream of living in Paris was about to come true, though Arthur seemed pleased to see her go. A few days later, Constance said goodbye to her mother and brother and set off for Paris. Upon arriving at Henri's house, she was handed a book of house rules, the first being that no one was allowed to wear Henri's slippers. That night, Constance learned that Henri did not like his daughter-in-law, Valerie. Henri confided in Constance, saying that Valerie was a crazy woman who wanted to send him to a nursing home. A few days later, while sitting alone, Constance considered playing the piano. She had learned to play as a child, but had stopped long ago. When she finally played, Henri became upset and asked her to leave the house. Somehow, Constance managed to convince him to let her stay, but she had no money for rent. After some thought, Henri told her that he didn't want money, but if she wanted to live in the house, she would have to do something for him. He asked her to help him break up Paul's marriage and seduce him. Constance didn't want to do any of this, but Henri promised that if she did, he would forgive 6 months' rent. When Constance left the house, she noticed a bar with a sign that said they needed a waitress. She spoke to a boy named Matthew about the job and was hired right away. The next morning, Henri's son, Paul, came to meet Constance. Paul was aware that his father didn't speak well of him. He had brought medicine for Henri and wanted Constance to take care of him, as Henri's health was worsening with age. When Henri returned, he immediately began mocking Paul, forcing him to leave. Henri was pleased to think that Constance had started getting closer to Paul, as part of his plan. The following day, Constance began working at the bar. In addition to her studies, she tried to build a friendly relationship with Henri, but studying had never been her strength, and it worried her. Henri had invited Paul over, and Constance prepared a meal to impress him. A little later, Paul and his wife Valerie arrived. After talking with Valerie, Constance understood why Henri didn't like her. Valerie was indeed cunning, making Constance's task for Henri easier. Constance began flirting with Paul, trying to get closer to him, and their conversations brought happiness to the shy Paul. At one point, they talked about the piano in Henri's house, which had once belonged to Henri's wife. Henri was unwilling to sell it or let anyone play it, which had caused arguments between him and Paul in the past. During one such argument, Henri asked Constance to play the piano. Hearing her play, Henri began to cry. Valerie assumed he disliked the music, but Paul explained that Henri was moved because the song reminded him of his late wife. Valerie continued talking about food, but Paul knew it was time to leave. The next day, Constance went to college, and upon seeing her results, she realized she had failed again. She left in tears, feeling defeated and unable to achieve anything in life. A few days later, Valerie came to Henri's house to collect some utensils, but when Constance fell ill, she ended up vomiting on them. Constance started crying in front of Henri and Valerie, overwhelmed by her misfortune. She explained that she couldn't go back home because she didn't want to work at her father's shop. Henri told her that she should pursue what she was interested in. Constance enjoyed playing the piano, but due to a teacher at school and her father's lack of support, she had stopped. With encouragement from Henri and Valerie, Constance sang a song she had written, and for the first time, Henri praised her. Curious about Henri's late wife, Constance learned that she had died 30 years ago by falling out of a window, and since then, Henri had lived alone. Constance laughed at the story, and Valerie assumed that Constance had feelings for Paul. After hearing this, Constance tried to talk to Henri, but he believed that Valerie had stayed with Paul all these years only for his money. Constance, however, knew that Valerie truly loved Paul. She refused to continue working for Henri, leading him to tell her to leave the house. The next day, Constance returned home, only to find that her room was being converted into an office. With everything happening, she lied to her parents, telling them she had passed her exams and that she needed to return to Paris immediately. That night, she returned to Henri's house, feeling helpless. She was forced to continue with the plan of entertaining Paul, and began asking Henri about Paul's likes and dislikes to gain his favor. On one hand, Constance had lost hope for a better life, but on the other, Henri started looking into enrolling her in a music school. A few days later, Constance began following Paul, and using the information Henri had given her to draw him closer. Paul started believing that they had similar interests, unaware that it was all part of a scheme. As he began to develop feelings for Constance, she took the opportunity to tell him that she wanted to start a relationship. However, Paul refused due to their age difference. Constance began to hate herself for playing this role, but Henri insisted that once Paul fell in love with her, she would need to end things. Her only task was to break up Paul's marriage. A few days later, Matthew told Constance that he wanted to go on tour with her, but Constance wasn't paying attention to him. Instead, she was focused on a DJ named Simon, and seeing this, Matthew walked away. Constance soon began a relationship with Simon, but around the same time, Paul confessed that he had started developing feelings for her and wanted to be with her. Now, Paul was pursuing Constance. He accompanied her to the club where Matthew worked as a DJ, and there, Constance realized that Simon had already moved on and forgotten about her. On the way home, Constance expressed her dissatisfaction with her life, but Paul managed to make her feel better. That night, Paul felt happy, believing that he had finally won Constance's affection. However, Paul stayed out all night, which caused Valerie to worry. That night, Valerie realized that Paul was cheating on her, and she gathered enough evidence to prove it. Henri's plan to drive Valerie away succeeded, and she left the house. Even after 2 days, Paul did not speak to Constance. One evening, Constance learned that Henri had applied for her admission to the London School of Music, and even recommended her to a well-known musician. A few days later, Paul visited Constance again, but she told him that whatever had happened between them, she wanted to forget it. She also revealed that she had found someone else, a guy her own age. Paul's heart was broken. He had lost both Valerie and Constance. The next day, Paul received a call from his lawyer, informing him that Valerie had filed for divorce. Everything was falling apart for Paul, but then Valerie contacted him, revealing that she was pregnant. This news saved their marriage, but when Paul shared it with Henri was not pleased. He immediately began questioning whether Paul even wanted to keep the baby. Paul's disappointment with his father's reaction grew, and he told Henri that when Valerie shares the news with him, he had better respond appropriately. Otherwise, Paul warned, he would never speak to Henri again. Paul shared the news with Constance as well, telling her that he was now happier than ever before. Constance was happy too, but one day her father discovered that she had failed her exam. Because of this, he called her back home. When Constance told Henri about this, Henri remarked that a father should never take away his children's happiness. However, Constance pointed out that Henri was doing exactly that by trying to take happiness away from Paul. At that moment, Henri was stopping Constance from drinking, explaining that the cause of his wife's death was alcohol. She had fallen from a building while intoxicated. The next morning, Constance began preparing to go home. Later that day, Valerie and Paul came to visit her. The three of them waited for Henri for several hours. When he finally returned, Valerie told him about their unborn son. Henri pretended to be happy for Paul's sake, but deep down, he struggled to maintain the charade for long. It was time for Constance to leave. Before she left, Henri advised her not to wait until old age to pursue her dreams. Hearing this, Constance made the decision to confront her father and firmly refused to return home. She declared that she wanted to be a musician, and that was why she would stay in Paris. At first, her father didn't listen to her, but then he realized that Constance was as stubborn as he was. In the end, Henri's loneliness disappeared forever. For months, Constance stayed in the same house, working day and night to prepare for her music exam. She composed her own song, and the time came for her to leave for London. Henri was confident that Constance would succeed, and he continued to support her, just as he had supported his wife. When Constance arrived at the London School of Music, she made her final preparations. Soon, the exam day came, and she managed to pass several rounds. A few weeks later, news of Henri's death arrived. When Constance returned home, Paul told her that Henri had been happy in his final days, as he had met his grandson and had seen Constance moving toward success. However, Constance revealed that she had failed in the last round of the exam. In response, Paul handed over Henri's house to her, explaining that she would need to stay in Paris for a few more months. Along with the house, Paul gave Constance a final letter from Henri, written especially for her. In the letter, Henri offered advice, saying that he had let go of all his grievances after meeting his grandson. He encouraged Constance never to give up. With this advice, Constance began preparing for her next exam, determined to continue her journey.